A couple of days ago, I made a Reddit thread on the Starcraft subreddit in which I asked people to ask me questions if they would like to about balance, personal life, anything related to Starcraft, anything not related to Starcraft. So here are the answers to the AMA thread that I did on Reddit. And the first question comes from Gordon Fruman asking, what are your thoughts on EMP? People have been suggesting everything from increasing energy cost, making it a damage over time to move it over to the Raven. Now, in general, I think that EMP is too strong. I think the Ghost is too strong in StarCraft 2 currently. And ideally, some power were to move away from the Ghost into other areas of the Terran army. I think this is really quite difficult to do, but slowly but surely some steps are being taken. We see a small radius reduction on the Ghost. Snipe has been made slightly worse against Zerg as well. So there is some power being taken away from the Ghost, and if necessary could be, try to store that somewhere else in the Terran army. Making an EMP damage over time is something that I personally would really like. I think in general there's a couple of changes that I think could be cool. So you could make the Ghost have like a kind of a damage over time thing. I think with Storm it would be cool that the first few ticks of damage would deal less damage and later on more, so that Storm has 80 damage total, and right now that is an even divided amount over time. So there's 20 damage per second, I think it is, or something like that. Now imagine that the first second only deals 5 damage, and then the second deals like 10 damage or so, and then it just goes up, and then the final second deals 40 damage overall. So the longer you stay in it, the more punishing it is. It's making it, not so much, oh, you walked in a storm for 1 second, half of your Marine army is now gone. It's more like, oh, you were in a storm for 1 second, but you microed out within 1 second. Good job, buddy. As a result, you now have still quite some HP left on your Marines. And I also feel like with a Disrupt or something that, for example, you could do is that you make it like a zone spell, that rather that's a ball that's flying, it really is more of a zoning tool, which you just click on the ground, then the ball starts moving towards it, and then it explodes from the middle outward. So you have like 3-4 seconds to move out of that area. That way it feels like there's a lot more counterplay to general AoE spells. And I think these 3 changes in combinations could remove a lot of the very frustrating, like kind of instant deaths that you have. And then the only unit we truly would still need to fix at that point would be the Widow Mine. But if all the other AoEs are a lot weaker, then I think the Widow Mine is also much easier to kind of tackle in that regard. So a question by No Technician 4815. I'm not sure how much is under NDA, but what is the process like in the group council discussions? From an outside perspective, it feels like the good ideas get shot down, and the only things that pass through are the leftover suggestions that probably won't immediately break the game. I'm personally way more concerned about how the council comes to decisions rather than the individual changes we've seen so far. Good point. I think that the process at which we're doing things has changed quite a bit. I think initially it just started with everyone just kind of saying what they thought was good, or more so focused on individual changes. And now I think it tends to be smaller groups of people kind of working on a more concise or comprehensive set of changes, where it's like, hey, we have these things in combination with another, what would people think of this, rather than just being like, I think the Ghost is too strong, we take out the Snipe. Because the moment you do that, then Terrans are like, well, if you take out the Snipe, we can beat Zerg. And then the Zergs are like, well, you just get into things way too quickly. Then I think a good way is to have a set of changes that you kind of offer as like basically a package deal, and then you can kind of take it from there. Now the exact process I don't think is entirely my place to disclose, is like, we do it exactly like this, but it tends to be the way that it's more a whole thing now, like more changes together rather than just individual ones. Acknowledging that the nerf to Banelings and Ghost is an indirect buff to Protoss, what is the reasoning for not directly buffing Protoss as the community have been clamoring for? So I understand why people want to buff a race directly. First of all, it feels really nice to receive buffs rather than everyone else just getting nerfs, because it feels like you're getting stronger and you're getting something new to do. For example, when initially in the first patch notes, we saw that the Hydra got the upgrades, put together. This allows for creativity from a Zerg point of view, and it allows for new play, new things, new timings. You can be innovative, you can be creative. I think that is cool, and I think that is ideally what you'd want, is that people can try new things out. However, sometimes it makes the situation much more complex if you try to buff a specific part of the unit rather than nerfing something that is too strong. So, for example, against Protoss, I think that the EMP is too strong overall, And now we could buff each individual Protoss unit a little bit, but that would also impact the PvZ matchup quite a bit. So instead, it might be easier to just nerf the EMP thing itself, rather than trying to buff what it's fighting against. Like another solution that you could have done is pick like individual units. I personally really liked the thought of having an Archon with more HP rather than more shields. But yeah, sometimes you don't get everything what you want. Well, not more HP than shields, but just in general, have a little bit more HP. So have an HP of 50 or 60 rather than just having the 10 right now. So that EMP would still be very impactful against the Archon, but it wouldn't be Archon's pre-EMP are S tier unit, and Archon's post-EMP are absolutely garbage tier. And that pretty much is still the case, and that saddens me, because it means that the Archon has less of a role. All right, here we have 2 questions in one by Ivano Filter. Dear Harstem, do you find it interesting that people think Ghost EMP radius is too large, making High Templar feedback ability ineffective? I do find that very interesting indeed. And then the second question he asked is, do you find it interesting that people think the Balance Council NDA is too large, making feedback ineffective? It's very difficult, I think, in general, to respond to feedback individually from a very large group of people, especially because everyone wants something completely different. Like, people often will speak like, oh, no one listens to the community feedback. They're not listening to the community feedback, but they might not be listening to the feedback that you want there to be listened to. Like, I myself am reading majority of the Reddit threads when it comes to balance suggestions, when it comes to the balance feedback. I think there's a lot of really bad suggestions. This is always the case whenever there's balance suggestions. I've mentioned it before, but whenever someone has an idea, 90% of the time it is complete garbage. And that's the case for all of my own ideas as well. And it's the case for most people's ideas. Like, most things just suck. That you didn't properly think it through. You forgot about some key details somewhere. And just like that, there is simply, well, I'm sure there's the time in the day to respond to every piece of feedback individually, but I don't think that is a very worthwhile use of time. I think probably something that the council could do better is if there's very big topics, like for example right now, you notice that there's a very big push within the community, especially from some of the lower levels, that think the Widow Mine is way too impactful, that the ability to harass there is way too easy, and the damage it deals is way too large. I think we could probably at some point formulate a response to that, and I think that needs to really come from a more official place rather than me answering individual claims whenever I go on Reddit. Like, I sometimes try to go in there if I think something is reasonable and, it's just slightly off the mark. I think it's good to go. But most of the time when you do something like that, people also feel attacked. And then I think it's very difficult. I really think that these things kind of need to come from a more, it's like, hey, Widow Mines seem to be an issue in the community. This is our current stance on the Widow Mine. Personally, on the Widow Mine, I think that at pro level, the Widow Mine drop, initial harassment is not much of an issue. If Protoss loses 15 workers to a Widow Mine drop, I think that kind of tends to be on them. I think it's a fun way of harassing at the high level. I think at lower level, there might definitely be some issues there. And if there's any good ways to kind of figure that out, to see, hey, how could we make it less effective on the lower level while still keeping these very high level Widow Mine drops in there, like the unburrowing, burrowing, like you see against 4-gate Blink, for example, is kind of a cool mechanic. And there's 2 things happening at the same time. It does allow for something out of Terran in the early game because it's the only non-committal harassment, or not super committed harass. So yeah, it's very difficult there. I wish there was a solution for this type of stuff, and if one comes, I'm like, we'd be happy to implement, or at least I'd be happy to implement it, if I speak for myself. Here a question by 3D Win, who asked, well, a crap ton of stuff. Everyone else is asking about the balance suggestions. So here, what are your favorite movies? Well, my favorite movie is In Bruges. When I was younger, I really liked Shawshank Redemption. I thought that was the greatest movie I'd ever seen. But yeah, In Bruges has been my favorite ever since I watched it. It's one of the only movies that in my adult life I've watched multiple times. Favorite songs? I particularly like Ode to the Mets by The Strokes, Do Me a Favor by the Arctic Monkeys, as well as No Buses by the Arctic Monkeys. And most of the songs on Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks album, I think, are very good. Favorite fruits? Mango, very, very high tier fruit. Favorite season, probably one that's a little bit colder. I freaking hate the heat. I can't stand it. Favorite units? I like the DT and I like the Immortal quite a bit. I think they're cool units. The DT, yeah. Blink on DT is one of the greatest things we've ever given the DT. That was a very good change. I appreciate you for that, David Kim. Actually, when that got announced, this was in like, I think 2016, and it was at one of the Blizzard like community get-togethers that we still did back in the day, I think at the Blizzard office. And the moment the DT Blink got announced, I remember the entire room just kind of went like, that sounds freaking terrible. People already hate DTs and giving them Blink. That, this ain't gonna be it, son. And I'm very happy that they did. I think it gives the DTs really an extra layer rather than just being this boring, cheesy unit. We've actually seen some cool plays with DTs, and I feel like it actually fixed some issues that we didn't even know were around back then by giving it Blink. It's funny how things work out like that sometimes. Favorite books? I'm honestly not much of a reader. There's been a period where I read a couple of books about like last year about Osama bin Laden, and there's a particular book by the journalist, I think he's called Peter Bergen. It's released in 2011, 2021, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. It's a very comprehensive book on Osama bin Laden. I think it's extraordinarily written and gives a very good look into the mind of a terrible man. So yeah, I'd hard recommend that. I also recommend the book that bin Laden's son and one of his wives wrote. I can't recall the name of that, but if you just Google "son of bin Laden" and wife bin Laden, it's a very good book as well. Favorite games other than Starcraft 2? That's a good question. I played a little bit Dota back in the day. I enjoyed it. I played a lot of Among Us, like maybe 200-300 hours or so. With mechanic, and that honestly was very, very fun. I think that lost a little bit of its potency. I don't think the game is as good anymore. Once people got better, that game got significantly worse. I think the game was best when everyone sucked. As of late, I honestly haven't been playing too many different things. I sometimes play games with Irene, but yeah, it's like escape room games, something along those lines. Like not a whole lot. I played Mario World. That was okay. Favorite active StarCraft 2 casters? I have a weak spot for Wardy. There's something beautiful about his voice. It's very relaxing to me. I can listen to it. He's very accurate in almost all of his descriptions, very accurate in his calls. He seems to be aware of his blind spots as well. So yeah, he's also a good friend of mine, so I'm a little bit biased. But I really like just listening to Wardy. He's a perfect background caster. You have him in the background. He's just nice. He's a warm sound. But at the same time, when I'm listening to him very actively, I also very much enjoy it. I think he has good insights. Favorite chess openings? E4? I haven't played chess in years, man. I have no clue. Favorite characters in Star Trek? Piss off. I don't know that. The guy with the hands that does this. I don't know what he's called. If you could master one martial art, what would it be? Probably Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Isn't that the best? I practiced mixed martial arts for a little bit when I was from 14 to 17 or so. We did a lot of wrestling on the ground. We didn't do a lot of standing fighting, if I recall correctly. Then I got punched in my ears a couple of times. I remember getting the big ears. I was like, this ain't for me. I also just got injured all the time, so it wasn't great. I saw there was more questions below this, by the way. So there we go. Also, is Danish a real language? I've heard conflicting opinions since the Netherlands and Denmark are basically the same thing. I heard someone say that you used to be Dutch. I just assumed you know. Piss off, mate. Good questions, though, 3D Win. Appreciate it. Pfire777 asks, what do you think about replacing the mothership with the Arbiter? Well, anything that comes from Brood War is, inherently inferior to anything StarCraft 2 related, so that sounds like an absolutely terrible idea. Why is the Terran Cyclone rework the focus in a patch that is supposed to fix PvT? I think this is a slight error as well. I think it's good to have experimental changes in, and I think it's good to try new things and to try to, change units up a little bit. But I think it is fairly obvious to most people that at the PvT level, at high level, there is no real way to make the Cyclone a very powerful unit without it being completely broken, because it just goes online either too fast or too slow. Right now at the high level, it feels too weak. Well, at the lower level, it feels completely busted because it's very easy to get into. It's easy to micro. Against Terran, in Terran versus Zerg, it seems way too strong as well. So I am not entirely sure why there's still so much focus on the Cyclone in my mind. it should be binned. And maybe look at it another time in the future, but just revert back to what it was. It had a nice niche role. The goal was to make it more core. I think that has failed. Then you accept your loss and say, hey, it sucks. Put a lot of time into testing this. Didn't end up working out. That's okay. Let's focus on the other, let's focus on the other changes. And I think that would be significantly smarter. Do people on the council ever take some inspiration for a balance rework from Reddit balance suggestions, or is it completely pointless to suggest any ideas? Not talking about feedback here, only new ideas. Yeah, I think the two things that I thought about as of late that I liked, both came from either someone in Twitch chat or something in my Discord or something in Reddit. I think a lot of the time, the actual idea isn't like perfectly worked out, but usually there's something of value in there which you can build upon. So for example, the Archon thing, it doesn't come out of me when, the moving the HP to the moving shields to the HP. And at some point, someone in my Twitch chat suggested that giving a Colossus maybe a second mode, one versus light and one versus non-light. That was an idea that really resonated with me. So you could make the Colossus have less range, for example, against Marauders, but deal way more damage. Well, in the early game, you still have that ability to fight off these Marine pushes, which can be very hard to do if you don't have extra versus light damage. That didn't quite end up working out, but there was some technical issues with that. But I think like those type of ideas, yeah, I almost always read everything that happens when it comes to balance suggestions. And I think there's a lot of people that read almost everything. And a lot of ideas, they don't necessarily get copied one-on-one, but there's definitely a lot of inspiration. Yeah, 100%. Hi, Captain. From what we gathered, the process within the community council to discuss the patch has changed. From the various video sources and Twitch comments, what we gathered is that the design changes are done by a small group within the balance council, that the remaining council is not, or in a lesser state, involved in the patch anymore and only busy with fine-tuning the numbers. Yeah, semi-correct. And that there were interesting ideas about the redesign of units in place with some limitation, other design implementation, which is why the lurker change didn't go through. Yes, thumbs up for that as well. Somewhat correct. In terms of communication, that does bring up to me a couple of questions. To what extent does everyone in the council get a voice representation between regions, races, experience / input? I think this is a question that is difficult to answer. I think people that want to put in more effort can put in more effort most of the time. That's the only thing I kind of want to say about that. So if you're really keen on working on a lot of changes, I think you can definitely do that. I myself have, for example, taken quite a bit of a step back, as it is really quite time intensive, and also it's a lot of headache just thinking a lot about balance. It's not, yeah. Is the scope of the patch changing? Can we expect bigger changes in the future? I think it's clear that this is an attempt to implement bigger changes. For example, the Cyclone and even the lurker changes were mentioned. Could you share within the scope of the NDA what the thought process is? I think the initial changes were pretty good design-wise. I think they pushed the game in a better decision. If you think back of before the Balance Council did anything, like reverting the Void Ray change was probably very good. I think when it comes to the actual balance side of things, there are definitely some things that need to be kind of ironed out there, where certain races are maybe winning a bit too much in tournaments, and other races, like the Protoss race, for example, not winning quite enough in the tournament. So yeah, I think ideally we kind of want to fix on getting that right first now, rather than really focusing very hard on getting new things in. I think if you're from a stable place and then you say, hey, we have a very experimental change that we want to try, and we're already in a stable place, and then it's kind of easier to say, okay, we'll just go back to what we had. We like what we had already. So I think it's possible that in the future we're going to see definitely a lot more experimental changes, but I think it's important to first get the kind of the fundamentals right when it comes to just the balance and the overall win rates, especially at the pro level. I also think that maybe even before some of these changes, in my opinion, maybe we should really look into some of the trying to fix some of the stuff that is really oppressive at the lower levels, and see if there's any nice solutions that can be found there, where you can make that a little bit easier to deal with without necessarily super influencing the very high level or making the skill ceiling much lower. So yeah, it is. It's very difficult. Let me see. There was another question, and why these units were considered maybe not a rework on the disruptor to give TOS more stability. No clue. Without breaking the NDA, could you share whether there are safeguards in place where Blizzard has allowed to step in or allow upgrades in case things are retrospectively seen as broken / imba? Could you share whether there are safeguards in place where Blizzard has allowed to step in? So you mean Blizzard would, at any point Blizzard can just it's their game. Like, we're really just advising. Like, they can do whatever they want. If Blizzard tomorrow says we're giving the Thor 10,000 HP, please don't do that, Blizzard. Then the Thor is gonna get 10,000 HP. I mean, I guess that's a safeguard in place. Lastly, I saw the video that Lambo posted today, and if you could, please give him a beer hug on behalf of us. Especially the last part of the video was messed up. I'm not a fan in how the current communication of the council has been, but if I look at the video and some of our community/comments, yeah, that was messed up. I think the community gets carried away sometimes, but there are also a lot of upvoted comments that show appreciation to the council. I think that last part, I actually think that, there's some people on Reddit that have been very wild on the changes. Most of the time, I think the stuff is relatively tame. Like, it's just, I think criticism is not bad to have. I think if we want to have very proper feedback, we should at some point have a dedicated channel to very proper feedback. Because right now, the problem is that Reddit is just not a good platform for getting very solid feedback, because there's also a lot of memes in between. And that is good. It is good that the Starcraft subreddit has memes and jokes. If it was all serious, like, no whining, like it kind of makes the community feel alive. So for the past few days, it's been a blast to be on Reddit, people flaming each other. So, hey, we're alive. So in a way, I feel as well that the feedback that we've received has been not great, but I think that's more because there isn't a way to really submit solid feedback. So once again, I think there just needs to be some type of form where people can send in replays, they write a little story next to it, and then if you don't want to see the memes, you don't go on Reddit and you just read the feedback stuff. I think that would be a better solution rather than saying, oh, community, stop posting memes. I think posting memes is good. And I think, even, to a certain extent, having some friendly banter is good as well. And some people obviously, even on Reddit, take it too far, but I think Reddit generally does an okay job at kind of making sure that no one goes completely out of line, which isn't the case in some of the personal messages. So, I'm not super upset about that, but I will give Lambo a hug next time I see him. Don't you worry about it, buddy. I'll take care of that. Question by QSQH. Are you trying to take into consideration for the balance patch the difficulty of execution? What I mean is that very often we see a Reddit thread where someone complains about balance and the answer is just get good. And indeed, it is just a skill problem, and balance is fine in that case. But if 99% of the player base isn't mechanically capable of using the intended counter to something, isn't that a problem to the game as a whole? Yeah, of course it is. This is why I think initially the carrier got the boot and the void ray. I think these units, they're too easy to use, and it at a high level it wasn't necessarily an issue. It provided very boring gameplay, which to me personally that offends me. But I think it is good to look at these things, at these interactions where the skill required to defend to the skill required to execute is definitely an issue. And like I mentioned before, I think I've seen the Widow Mine being mentioned as a very frequent offender there, at least in the experience of a lot of Protoss players. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at these things, but this is actually legitimately very difficult to fix. I'm also not a game designer, and we have limited technical abilities of what we can do as well. So the things that we can't touch everything because we're not Blizzard. So yeah, it is difficult, but it's something that is definitely always being considered, or at least should always be considered. And I always try to keep it in mind as well. Yeah, for sure. Does the council react to the criticism on Reddit? Naturally, you cannot make a patch that makes everyone happy, but I think Zombie Grub said it quite well on her stream last night, that when the uproar and the backlash is so severe, it's something you should pay attention to. I think most people are very aware of what Reddit thinks. It's also very difficult because no matter what you do, there's always going to be a lot of people that are most likely going to be upset because they feel like they're getting shafted in some way. So I think it is good, like if all around you just see like, hey, the Cyclone is going to be boring and it's going to make games much worse. It feels very unfun at the lower level. I think this is very important criticism and feedback to listen to. However, if someone, like if you see 33% of the population complaining about Snipe getting nerfed, then it's like, well, these are probably just the Terrans that are on Reddit, and Terrans cry about everything. So it's like, do we really want to listen to that? Probably not. It's the same. So if it's like a very like kind of a balanced, whiny like type of thing, and it doesn't really seem to be across the board, then I don't think obviously you're still reading it and you're thinking about like, hey, does this criticism or does this feedback, is this valid, or like, are we aware of this? And if we're already aware of this, or if I'm aware of this, then I'm like, okay, I'm aware of this. I thought about this. I don't think this is true. But if it's like, hey, this is going to destroy everyone to 5k MMR, and it's like, hey, maybe we should get some more data on what actually happens in that MMR range, you know, like replays, or just trying to think more clearly on like what the Cyclone is going to do there, or what X or Y change is going to do at that particular range. Yeah, of course. No, I think that's super important. Yeah, 100%. Did representatives from all races in the Balance Council agree to super buff the Cyclone? Yep. Oh, Captain, my Captain, how many people are in the Balance Council roughly? Is it like 15 people or more like 100 people? It's a lot of people. Really a lot of people. Isn't there too much focus to try and change the Cyclone when it's an inherently boring unit when mass, and isn't trying to make it work distracting the council from other topics? I don't think it's necessarily bad to try things. I think it's good that if you have a unit that right now in a lot of matchup doesn't fulfill a very satisfying role, and you can try and do something with it. I do believe that at this point, the ship has pretty much sailed, and I think it makes a lot of the other testing that you're trying to do a little bit worse and less impactful. So yeah, in my mind, this is the Cyclone dream is dead. Yeah, for me at least. Mr. Hamster, what is your unpopular opinion regarding StarCraft 2 balance among the Balance Council? I think the battle cruisers are too strong. I'm not sure how unpopular this is, but I don't think they're too strong at the highest level. Whenever I talk with my brother, he complains to me about the battle cruiser. And whenever I see lower level games with the battle cruiser in it, it just seems impossible to beat, because they can be in 2 locations at the same time. They're really strong by themselves. They have an ability to one-shot every single unit. I'm sure they're a fun unit to play with if you're a Terran player. It seems freaking hard if you're not a high-level pro and you know how to split your army. Yeah, I don't like the battle cruiser. It's a very unpopular opinion, probably everywhere. I think it's not fair. Oh no. Why does StarCraft 2 stick to a very standard map formula? Is there any discussion? More strange map to the map. Ooh! Is there something inherently broken with small pathways, 3 people maps, and overall? How do you feel about map diversity in recent years in StarCraft 2? This, I hate so much this question. Well, this question in particular is worded okay, but it's the sentiment that's behind it. Whenever there's any discussion ever about maps in StarCraft 2, literally every single time what happens is some guy will say, oh, the new map has arrived. Oh, big surprise. All of them are standard maps. And then the next Reddit comment or the next tweet is going to read, yes, this is because pro players hate playing non-standard maps. They just love doing the same thing again and again and again. They would never want to have anything different. It's like, mate, I'm playing the same game for 13 freaking years. I would love if there was some good, new, creative maps that play out different. I have legitimately 0 issues with that. The problem is that non-standard tends to just be a synonym for utter garbage. What ends up happening is that someone creates a garbage map, and that when people don't like it, they go, well, it's a non-standard map. It's like, yes, both players have one base and there's a massive tunnel you need to run through. There's creeps in the middle of the map. Like, this is Warcraft 3. Like, this is not non-standard. This is crap. And you know it as well. Like, there are some maps which I think were freaking brilliant, that were creative and allowed creative play. I think the one map that I always call out for this is Golden Wall. I think Golden Wall was so freaking good. Like, it played out in a completely different way. There was many ways to play on this map. That was a good map. Now, if you think of a crap map that was creative, Waystation. Waystation, for the people who don't know about Waystation had 4 spawn locations. And it was different in the way that if you'd spawn on the top left and bottom right, the map was completely different. It wasn't symmetrical on 4 spots. It was symmetrical on 2 spots. And then if you had the other 2 spots, it was symmetrical in that way. But the map was complete garbage overall. It was super open in the middle. Everything sucked about it. It just played super boring games. And the gimmick wasn't fun either. This is what people consider a non-standard map. And then I rant against it. People are like, oh, pro gamers hate the non-standard. No, I hate crap maps. If you have a really cool map that allows for creativity and innovation, that is completely fine. If you create a garbage map in which I just have to camp for the first 10 minutes of the game until I can interact with my opponent, that is not a fun, creative map. That is boring. You're going to get camping games literally every single time. Like, it is awful. I don't understand why that's the case. People don't actually think when they look at maps. Like, people legitimately would see a map with 12 Selnaga watchtowers, go like, yeah, fun creativity. It's like, no, people are just gonna camp around the watchtowers. You're never gonna have a single fight. This is gonna be garbage. This is nothing to do with creativity or innovation. You just use a gimmick that isn't even good, and then you get like, this is like if you're making a pop song, you know. It's like, pop artists only make the same pop songs. Why do they never make something like this? And you play your 4 chords, and in the middle of the song, you just hear a guy peeing in the toilet for 35 seconds straight. And then when people criticize you, it's like, why is there a guy peeing in the toilet? Why am I supposed to hear? Why am I supposed to listen to this for 35 seconds straight? You're like, you just hate creativity. You stupid standard pop stars. They don't like it when you change the 4 chords. It's like, piss off. Like, I don't mind good maps, but I do. I don't mind good maps that are creative, but I do mind bad maps that are creative. So if there's a good map with good innovative play, put them in. I don't give a crap about that. Overall, I think the map diversity, it probably could be better. I think I think it could be better. I think there's definitely a bit of a bias to the super standard in a way, and having a harder time to take a fort, for example, or I think it could play out interesting, but that really does impact balance as well. So it's something you always need to kind of keep in mind. I think a good solution there would be to just introduce more maps into the general map pool. So rather than having 7 maps, you could put in 9 maps or 11 maps, so you could veto more. And this is something that's also being looked into. So because if you can veto more, then you can have more matchup specific maps as well, which would be super freaking cool. So yeah. Why not Colossus buffs when it's underused and can offer more stability when disruptors are getting a nerf? It just seems like it was a little stronger and a little cheaper. Ultras can be cheaper, but not a Colossus. It could get a lot more use. I mean, this is definitely a path that could have been taken. I think for now, the main problem really with the strength of Terran in the mid game, to me, feels like it is in the Ghost. Before that, Protoss can trade pretty well against just a bio army. I think the problem is the Ghost. And I think, like I said, rather than just buffing individual unit out of Protoss, I think it's better to just nerf the thing that is a little bit too strong. And I know a lot of people disagree on that, but I think this is slightly better. Of course, you could do a combination of the two. Like if just the Ghost nerf doesn't seem to be enough, you could think about getting a slight buff for the Colossus. I think there's also something funky with the numbers on the Colossus. Made it really difficult to buff the damage without changing the interactions with the amount of hits you'd require, I think, specifically to kill a Marauder. So I think usually it's like 7 shots or something, like with +3, and it ended up going to 5. There was something very funky about it with the numbers that were looked into, and thus I think that kind of changed it away from this. So it was difficult to make a small change. I guess you could make it cheaper, but making it cheaper doesn't really increase the value of the Colossus so much. The thing with the Colossus mainly is not the cost, it is the time in the robo, as well as the gas. So the mineral cost, I guess you could make it slightly gas intense. That might have bad outcomes as well when it comes to all-inning. So it's very difficult, but there's a couple of reasons. But yeah, I hope that the Ghost is going to provide enough there, as well as a slight immortal buff. If that's not the case, then other numbers can always be tweaked. Question by K-Sin. It seems to me that the main problem with Protoss is that once their robo units are gone, they lose the game. They can win 5 fights with a Terran, but will lose the game if their robo units are wiped once. Why not try and address that? Cheaper robo, smaller footprint, move War Prism or Observer to a different building, an upgrade after Fleet Beacon that makes robos produce faster / double units. Either that or their Gateway army needs a buff. I appreciate the Ghost / Raven nerfs, they are needed as there's little counter in their live iterations, but what about looking at the design / structure of Protoss instead of adding / subtracting stats on units? So I think a lot of what you're saying there, the cheaper robo or the smaller, I'm not quite sure what a smaller footprint means. Just make the building smaller or what? Move the War Prism or Observer to a different building. I'm not entirely sure how great it is. I think you could say something about maybe making some of the robo units a little bit cheaper, but I'm not entirely sure how much that of an issue is. Like as a TOS, what you can do and what we have seen as of late is that people are just adding more robotics facilities. Yes, it sucks if you lose 4 disruptors or 8 disruptors. If you have 4 robots, you can very quickly reproduce that. don't actually think that is necessarily the biggest issue. I personally also, at least at my level, I don't super struggle with the Terran late game necessarily if I'm playing people that are on my level, and even against higher levels. I always feel like that in the late game versus Terrans, I can reach a bit above my MMR really. So I'm not entirely sure if I feel that the late game is actually a massive issue for Protoss. For me personally, it feels like a lot of tosses are dying at the 7 or the 8 minute mark after taking a little bit of damage in the early game, or they're kind of getting destroyed in the mid game before they can get to that super late game RB. It's really hard to stabilize a game as TOS. That feels to me like the main issues. I'm not sure if rebuild, yes, if TOS loses all of its expensive robo units, it tends to die in the late game, despite Terran having just basically pure barracks units most of the time, maybe mixed in with a couple of liberators. But I'm not sure if I would necessarily agree that that is the biggest issue that TOS faces. So that's also not really what the changes are trying to address so much in my mind. Kevin, I appreciate everything you've done for the StarCraft 2 community and the positivity you bring to your videos. Somehow you create an encouraging series based on telling people they suck. Thank you. I've always been curious how much attention you and other streamers pay to or aware what kind of content other streamers are making. For instance, you have played Uthermal without realizing it before. Are you familiar with his Terran challenges? Yep, I'm familiar with most of Uthermal's challenges. I don't really watch any other videos. I sometimes watch my own videos back, especially the older ones. I think they're quite funny. And sometimes I just watch to see if there's anything that I could have, improved maybe. But I don't really watch a whole lot of other content. I watch some guides every now and again, but I'm a relatively calm YouTube watcher. I don't check so much out. I love you and Lambo together. You're a great duo. Are there any plans for more collaborations in the future outside of your Noobs in Disguise series? Yeah, if anything pops up or if you have any idea, then Lambo and we're keen to work together. What's your favorite thing about being married? It honestly didn't change so much. I think the biggest step for me was from being apart to living together. I think that was freaking huge. It's so nice to just constantly have the person that you probably like the most in your life to have them around. So yeah, it's just that's been great. You're just hanging out all the time with your best friend. It's pretty tight. So yeah, I've been enjoying that massively. Being married for me, it didn't really change our relationship at all. How did your parents respond to you becoming a streamer? Well, yeah, I'm a pro gamer, mate. Do you feel any pressure to pursue a more stable career? No, I don't feel any pressure at all. So when I was 14, my mom went with me to a screening of the film, what's it called? It's like a film about Grubby and Sky in Warcraft 3. It was played in a big theater in Amsterdam. And at the same time, there also was the finals of, at the time, the ESL Pro Series that was being played. So I think before that, they weren't quite sure what was going on. They were pretty afraid that was going to be... people keep forgetting this, but this was now 15 years ago. I think the stereotyping of gamers was way worse back then. You really were kind of like a basement dweller. That really was the standard stereotypes. Nowadays, everyone really plays games, but back then, some people might play FIFA and they play the PlayStation a bit, but the regular computer games, basement dwellers 100% of the time. So I think my parents were probably a little bit afraid of that. And then when I went there to the screening of that movie, and there was one pro player that I had spoken before, a semi-pro player in Warcraft 3, called Tsuyoku. It's a very difficult name. I'm even mispronouncing it now. And he spent maybe an hour or so just talking to my mom and just explaining, because I was very young. Everyone in the Warcraft 3 scene was quite a bit older, 22, 23. And they just talked for maybe an hour. And I think that really impacted the way that my parents view gaming in general. Because they just knew that the people in it were normal and they were nice. And everyone there just seemed kind of well put together. There were no complete idiots there. It's just normal people having a hobby. And I think once they realized that, they were very open to the idea of me being a pro gamer, which is something that I think ever since I went there as well, I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do from now on out. I don't care in what game. And then StarCraft 2 came out 2 years before I finished high school. So that's pretty much how that path went. So I feel legitimately zero pressure from anyone to ever change. And if I were to feel any pressure from anyone to change, then I probably just cut that person out of my life, because I really enjoy what I do. And I don't understand why I would have to change that if right now I feel like I'm in a good place there. If you could start your career over again, but you couldn't use Harstem, what name would you use? There was a Night Elf player in Warcraft 3 that had the name Tadpole. I always thought that was a cute name. He was not a very good elf player. He was Dutch as well. And I thought it was a good name. So I think I might have stolen that then. Because I don't think there's any good StarCraft players that are called Tadpole. So I think it's quite good. Of course, the negative point there is that if you get Googled, you're just going to see the little froggies rather than actually seeing me pop up. And now if you Google Harstem, you see me with a sombrero. So that is very high tier. Jopsta asks, where does the name Harstem come from and how did you find learning English? It boggles my mind how someone can play StarCraft 2 at such a high level while cracking relatively complex analogy jokes in their second language. Me and my friend made this up when I was like 12 or 11. I needed a name for the ESL Amateur series back then for Warcraft 3, and I think we came up with Harstem. It boggles my mind how someone can play StarCraft at such a high level. Okay, right. Learning English, it just kind of happens naturally when you're Dutch. I think a lot of things don't get translated. So, for example, the Pokemon games and most online games that you're playing are all going to be in English. So it's kind of necessary in order to survive in the world of Warcraft 3 or Starcraft or whatever game you play or whatever media you're interested in. Yes, most TV shows are going to have translations and some of them will even be synchronized. But I think if you're kind of, exploring on yourself the entertainment on the internet, naturally you're going to learn a lot of English. On top of that, I also did bilingual education in high school. So half of all of my classes were in English, mathematics, biology, geography, history, all were in English, at least for the first 3 years of my high school career. And after that, it kind of dialed down because I had to prepare for the Dutch exams as well. Because despite me doing a bilingual study, I still had to do my exams in Dutch for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure which idiot came up with that, but I guess that is your high school curriculum for you. On balance, I feel like Protoss has always had the rough end of the sticks. Perhaps a gateway unit that is defensively decent, but needs to be warped in on a Nexus super pylon, locked behind a Cybercorp tech structure. For example, Dragoons. Play around with the idea of giving a speed boost effect on pylons to a Protoss unit. Spitballing, of course. I think getting new units in the game at this point is extremely unlikely. And it's just not happening, I think. Like 90% certain on that, unless something big changes in the next few years. Speed pylon. Play around with the idea of giving a speed boost effect on pylons to a Protoss unit. You could do that, I guess. I don't think these are any of the options that we're currently looking into, or I don't think we're looking into any of this in the near future. No, sorry, Jopsta. Question from an absolute idiot, but I don't understand the reasoning behind Banelings can one-shot probes is bad, while they're single-use and, well, not invisible, while Widow Mines can wipe out an entire mineral line is okay, and they're reusable and invisible. As a massive noob, this is very confusing to me, since mines are barely more expensive than mains, and so annoying to deal with, where Banes do give the possibility to sacrifice some stuff for them to die on. At least once they're dead, and we see them coming. Don't get me wrong, I'm a complete trash tier toss, so anything that helps my probes not die makes me happy. But I'm just wondering why Banelings are getting nerfed when Widow Mines aren't, and would love some insight on that. So I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to change the Widow Mine is because it has a massive impact on so many stages of the game. So it is really important currently in the early game versus Protoss. It is extremely important in the Terran versus Zerg matchup at basically every single stage. It's not that big in TVT, but it does get used every now and again. So changing that unit would mean that you introduce a lot of complexity that would make it much harder. So and it's also not necessarily a super big problem at the highest level. This is an issue that, especially at the lower levels, is going to be much more pronounced than at the higher level. I think the mine definitely is very strong still at high level. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's, especially for Protoss, a massive issue. More so maybe for Zerg with Ling Bane. So yeah, I think this is something that we're definitely trying to look into, but it is very difficult to kind of map all the interactions that are happening and trying to find some type of compensation there without influencing other things. Like the more parts are moving, just the harder in general it's going to be. So yeah, I understand completely that the mine is probably the most whined about unit right now. And you see the Baneling getting nerfed, see the Disruptor getting nerfed, but these interactions tend to be a little bit more straightforward, especially when it comes to the +2 Bane thing. Removing that doesn't impact too many other things. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but it is a very difficult little conundrum that you have over there. All right, Michael26 and the final question for today. Hey Harstem, I know everyone else is asking dumb balance questions, but I don't care about that. What is your favorite IODIS episode and why? It is my favorite show that I love watching while eating food on a Thursday. Mine's personally is the Echo Soldier episode, and then there's the link to that episode. Ooh, my favorite IODIS episode. So I'm a nostalgic sucker. So I think I'm actually gonna go with some of the earlier ones. There's just something beautiful about, you know, a younger Harstem, a less experienced Harstem when it comes to the roasting, completely destroying Loco with the initial replay, which was on I think the map was called Ice and Chrome, where he played the Corruptor Hydra against Mac. I think that's one of my favorites. I think back fondly of some of the references I made there. I watch it every now and again. I think there was nice jokes in there. The game definitely did deliver. Loco took it like a champ. One of my favorite things is actually the video that he produced watching it. There's some great moments in there. Yeah, and also that technically was so there's two videos that have been absolutely instrumental in my rise on YouTube in a way. So that's the first one was the pretending to be AFK one, which exposed me to a very large audience, and then the Loco one with Loco's audience helping out there. It gave a massive boost to me personally. So I'm eternally grateful to the king of StarCraft 2 YouTube for that. And yeah, I think that is pretty much going to be it for me today. So yeah, it's going to be the first Loco episode for sure. That's going to be it for me today. I'm sorry if I didn't end up answering your question. It could be that there was too much overlap with other questions that I already had answered, or it's just because I missed. There was a crap ton of stuff. I think there was like over 400 comments or so, and I've tried my best to answer as many as well as I could. And that is pretty much going to be it. Yeah. All right. If people like this, I could do one more in the future, maybe with a little bit less of a focus on balance at that point, and maybe more with a focus on questions that you want to see answered about either my personal life or just stories from the past in StarCraft 2. I always enjoy talking about the past in StarCraft 2. I think there's a lot of good characters there that have been underexposed. That's going to be it for me. And yeah, thanks so much for submitting all the questions, for your patience, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.